CEOs have never had a lower confidence interval that they have a finger on the pulse of their organization, that they know where the risk lies, that they know where the opportunity lies. And so I think this frame on employee experience has I'd say it's the hot spot, if you will, in the continuum, in the ecosystem of CX and product experience. If you dissect different facets of the continuum or ecosystem that we play in, there's a lot of work, a lot of good work being done. But if you take a holistic frame and a bit of a step back, I think we'll see lots of holes today in how different organizations are solving for the connective tissue that brings this together. And even in your brief opening, Mike, the employee experience angle, I think, has put a really unique pressure test on a much more long-standing and long-tenured frame in customer experience, right? Everybody has known the customer has been important, for a really long time, since wheels were square. But the employee frame, I think COVID and some of the aftermath and this hybrid work environment that we're in, from executives that I talk to, led by the client landscape, CEOs have never had a lower confidence interval that they have a finger on the pulse of their organization, that they know where the risk lies, that they know where the opportunity lies. And so I think this frame on employee experience has I'd say it's the hot spot, if you will, in the continuum, in the ecosystem of CX and product experience. But I have, I'd say a student, and that, there's hopefully real humility that comes with that, because I am humbled by, coming up the learning curve while I've been involved with, in particular, CX for the better part of 25 years. It's a different frame when you're looking at the connected tissue, but between these disparate connection points. So little bit on me, and excited for the discussion.
Oh, thanks. I mean, you've summarized kind of the basic perspective that we've built and publish around. Been doing so over the past 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years, something like that. But it was interesting that EX, this is from my perspective, and it's granted it's a sidelines perspective, EX was almost a token topic to be addressed, if you will, say 3 years ago. Yes. It was something people recognized they needed to acknowledge, but weren't ready to, I think. Talking to the enterprises that I talked to, it was a great thing. And then COVID hit and it became the topic.
That's right.
It just became, followed by a whole list of expletives that indicated they should have been dealing with this a long time ago. But I've spoken to essentially everybody I speak with in the CX world now is thinking about their efforts in terms of CX and EX. The unique thing I find about your offering is that you're fusing that with product experience as well. Yeah. And that takes a whole different set of disciplines. That's not something that, frankly, I don't think anybody else is thinking about in the folks that I speak with. So I would love to talk about, from your perspective, which is an elevated perspective. You sit at what I would call the pinnacle of certainly near the pinnacle of that world, and have a perspective on probably broader trends than most people do. Mm-hmm. By virtue of that, I would love to just get your thoughts on, even from the most basic, how do enterprises start to think about CX in a modern way?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot that goes into it, a lot of cultural change and change management and all that stuff. But how do modern enterprises start to think about modern CX fusing in EX? What are those hurdles? How are they overcome? How does Rightpoint help and solve those problems? And then layering in the whole product experience angle as well, which may not even sound like a question. I think I've basically just dumped the whole thing on you and said,
that's all good.
Please unpack and clarify.
Yep, appreciate that, and I love the opportunity to dissect it in this holistic frame. Again, the we call total experience. I'll take it from a little bit of, I'd say, as we opened, some of the more at least known commodities on the surface, and I do think that starts with CX, because I think from an unaided awareness standpoint, but before data starts to be unfolded, I feel like most leaders would say they have a good finger on the pulse of what's happening with their customers. I think you and I would probably challenge that a bit because of the complications of the environment and the ecosystem around it. And then there's this whole other frame that I'd love to save some good time for on the measurement of it. And that measurement becomes even more complicated as you start to unpack the facets of customer experience, employee experience, and product experience in this kind of ecosystem that we call total experience. So if we're gonna go, inside out, then maybe maybe even starting with the employee frame is the best way to do it. And there's this one quote that I have fallen in love with, really coming through and graduating from the COVID experience, as you nodded to, which I think was a real catalyst to get leaders to pay attention to employee experience. And that quote was, the fastest way to get customers to love your brand is to get employees to love their jobs. Again, lots of the territory that we'll cover, Mike, simple on a read. I don't think anyone will disagree with that. And that was by Tiffany Bova. She's the author of The Experience Mindset. I've had the opportunity to engage with her. I think she sees things, very clearly. I'd like to think I'm a practitioner in what Rightpoint does to enable and enact and implement much of the mindset and strategy that she talks about. For that matter, Gartner, preeminent, not only advisor, but obviously analyst, they've spent a bunch of time on their own frame on total experience. I think you have a lot of folks circling the right territories. But I like this, inside outside perspective, which, has to start in my mind with employees. And we nodded to it a little bit on the opening, but, I think the easiest conversation to strike a chord with today is AI. I think that, there's still so much to be, figured out there, led by some standardization. But that's the easiest discussion that I can see in the C-suite today, because there's a significant complex associated with it. I'd say that's closely followed by asking any executive their confidence interval that they are endearing themselves to their employee base, that their employee base has the tools and connections today that they can have a fulfilling experience. And I think that's where everything starts to break down from a complex standpoint.
I'd be interested to know if you have some sort of a mental index of how those C-suite leaders are processing, like what is their confidence level across the board? If there is some sort of I think overall they're at 50-50, or maybe they generally have what's your gut read on that?
My gut read is upwards of 80% of the C-suite that I speak to lack a significant and appropriate confidence interval that they have the right employee experience infrastructure and ecosystem in place for their organizations.
It's a big number. It's a big number. It's on the one hand, it's a scary number, but on the other hand, it's a huge opportunity for jumping ahead of the curve.
Yep. And I think, one way to test that, I think if you ask on the blink, maybe that number would be less intimidating than the 80%. But when you start asking questions about, well, how do you judge, especially for organizations of scale? I'll use maybe the business that I know best in professional services. Where do you look at, high performance? Very often you'll hear utilization, reports, but I struggle to think there's a lot of factors, including fortune, that go into play as to how people get staffed to certain projects. So I struggle to think that a utilization report is going to tell you the rising stars of an organization. Mike, you and I, just judging by the color of our hair, have been in this line of work for a while, and I think about how we showed hustle, how we showed grit as we grew up in corporate America, and how we, for the longest period of time, to your frame, up until 3-4 years ago, how we would judge that showing of hustle, that showing of grit. And I'll take it back for me very personally to first job, 9 days out of college. I started at Citibank. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing. But I wanted to show and I wanted to impress that this scrappy, undersized kid from Staten Island was going to hustle. So, I made a commitment to myself that I was going to, put the lights on in the morning and I was going to shut the lights off, when I left. And I had hoped that would yield a proxy that I cared. That, while I was still trying to figure out, the difference between a checking and a savings account, that there was this proxy for hustle and the investment I was willing to make. Well, again, take that back to an executive conversation. Like, how can you see in a hybrid environment, in some cases fully remote environment, well, where's the confidence interval of an executive that they know where that tenacity, where that grit, where that hustle lies in their organization? Conversations break down all the time on that because they can't see it. Because there's not the ubiquitous water cooler that Mike and Ron had to be able to show for ourselves, growing up in the space, and to observe as we became leaders. So again, back to the 80% number, folks may be taking it back, but as you start to probe on where I went a little bit with what do you use to measure utilization reports, in professional services, not going to tell you that. And it puts so much pressure, through digital channels and though, Teams and Zoom and lots of other forms have come a long way. I think it lacks its ability to touch on, all 5 of the senses and to really give an executive an ability to do that. So that puts the pressure on what is the digital tool set that can have an infrastructure effect to serve as a proxy on how your employees are feeling, and then what are you doing to be able to create a corrective action plan in a segmented way, ideally where you would have a different treatment based on the roles, the responsibilities, even the DNA of your population. As we know, young millennials and Gen Z are going to react, very differently to someone in a more mature part of the workforce, and too often there's catch-all buckets that are there. So I think the more questions you ask, in my experience, to the C-suite about how they're currently managing and leading through employee experience in this new normal, the more you'll see that number grow with a lack of confidence.
I mean, you related. I completely share your perspective. Mine, again, is from the sidelines. You're deep in the middle of it, but you related that kind of through a lens of how we all operate in the digital world now, and we don't have the face-to-face nuances of all the interactions that we used to have. And that makes it much more difficult. But I don't know, and I'd love your perspective on this, that even if this was a face-to-face world like it used to be, measuring things like sentiment and grit and where effectiveness lies in a workspace is just plain difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, coming up with those tools is requires some real thinking. How does Rightpoint address those without giving away any kind of secret sauce?
Yeah, no, I'd say that there's an advisory frame, right? That almost always starts, as a consultancy will do, a deep dive to understand the. I'd say it starts with a bit of a confidence interval, because I think that can be very telling. It often will not be where we end up after we leave some, what I'll call discovery workshop, to understand how does the sentiment of the leadership, which is always a strong place to start, how does that match the entire organization? Often, again, until probed, confidence levels can be higher in spots, but when the real probing starts and the real discovery, a lot can fall down on that. So I think that there's this advisory frame that can start to map current objectives against current initiatives, and data, as always, will play a huge role, to your point, in the sentiment analysis. I think where I went with the conversation, that there is a subjective frame, as leaders make decisions all day, every day, with an imperfect data set in front of them. And as much as survey tools, I think, can be really, really powerful. The story that somebody tells you and the data tells you can vary from a story observed, from a story experienced, and it's difficult to account for that in scoring. So I do think that there is that as leaders, there's a big tangible part of this equation, and the more we can drive towards the tangible and allow data to normalize outliers, the better we'll be. But we cannot let that take away from that there's an intangible frame as well associated with that. And I do see big variances when I'm talking to financial services organizations, where they have had a much greater push on return to office, for instance, than to I'd say more digitally native companies that have had a higher degree of embracing hybrid, and in some cases even fully remote. So I think it's a very different approach from an advisory, from a strategy standpoint, but it has to start with some scoring across tangible and intangible measures over perception, over where they are, where they want to go, and then outlining different tracks that will very often take the form of understanding process, tools, and data in support of you have to set the goalposts before you embark on an action plan. So what if that scoreboard is moving. Are your key performance indicators, are your measurable business results, are they moving as a result of corrective action plans you're taking?
I want to take a quick break from the conversation to tell you about one of our sponsors. What could you achieve if you knew what your customers expected ahead of time? What if you could know what customers expect by category and by brand 12 to 18 months ahead of traditional brand tracking methods? And what if you could know exactly where to adjust and where to spend in order to drive the most benefit every time? A customer expectation audit allows you to identify areas that require strategic reinforcement, as well as pinpoint which values will contribute most to an emotional bond with your brand, and optimize accordingly. Customerland has partnered with Brand Keys, the world's oldest loyalty-focused consumer research firm, to bring real-world customer expectation audits to brands, brand managers, and to CX practitioners everywhere. Want to know where your brand stands and exactly what to do about it? Go to expectationaudit.com. That's expectationaudit.com and download a sample audit today. So we've talked about discovery a little bit, and what methods and how you approach identifying those gaps and opportunities. Implementing EX and CX is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the rubber meets the road right there, and that can be extremely complex and difficult because of cultural differences, because of the way incentives are structured, because of all the siloing we've all been talking about for 15 years now, and all that. So how does Rightpoint think about that, about implementing these kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a really powerful frame. And I think a little bit to where we opened, this is where the measurement aspect of our frame on total experience has manifested itself into something we call ROTX, or return on total experience. As Mike, you and I know, for many, many years, if you just put in Google ROX or ROE, some proxy for return on experience, you will see endless amounts of content produced by every large-scale consultancy, advertising firm that's out there on their perspective on how to measure that return on experience. I would challenge you or anyone to try to stay awake on slide 3. I find it nearly impossible. It is.
I'm challenged. I'll accept that challenge and see if I can actually do it.
Good luck. It is a sea of sameness. And back to the tangible and intangible frame, very little that's tangible on how this measurement of experience comes through. Many clients that I've worked with for over 2 decades now will want to ladder back to a known commodity, and I'll use the example such as an NPS score. I think there's some flaws in the NPS methodology. I don't think it's perfect, but it is a ubiquitous yardstick that gives an organization an ability to score themselves against a competitive set. And company A can be across facets that matter to them a 6.8, and they want to get to an 8.3. And then you can have some frame on what are the activities that you have to engage on to close that gap. And I think there's a perfect no, but there is a uniformity in that yardstick that sets an action plan post measurement. Nothing like that exists in the experience place today that I know of, that can provide that yardstick in a clear, concise way that could span industries and verticals, and to give a uniform view on how to close it. That gets further complicated by now we're no longer just talking about customer experience, where the whole industry, for understandable reasons, has been dominated. Well, off the heels of the employee experience conversation we came from, and a low confidence interval by executives that they have their finger on that pulse, then you overlay a product frame, or in some cases that product may take the form of services landscape. So now you're looking at this total experience landscape of customers, of employees, of products, and you're trying to develop a yardstick that sits across. Even harder for the dated content that's out there that tries to unpack return on experience. So the level of difficulty is on the rise.
So are you suggesting that return on total experience should become the new yardstick?
I think we have work to do. I'd love to stake that claim. I think, excuse me.
And then that's not to be coy, but I completely agree with you that there's nothing with that kind of ubiquity that NPS has And I like you and like everybody else who follows the space, I think it's a deeply flawed measurement. It's misused terribly so many times, but it's there, and it does give you something to measure yourselves against. So
What I'll say, Mike, is that I believe return on experience has nailed the problem statement. I have not received the counter opinion through dozens of prospect and client and analyst meetings. Nobody has pushed back to say, I think you're wrong. I think you're off. I think it exists and you just haven't been paying attention. So I think the problem statement has almost, as far as I could tell, uniform alignment on having nailed that. I think the methodology is a blossoming work in progress. We will map journeys. We will put key performance indicators and measurable business results. I can give an example of what something like that looks like. It's very unique. It's very specific for each client, which has its own challenge because then it takes on a bit of that snowflake frame that something like an NPS does bring similarity to. But I think the methodology is in a good blossoming place. Ultimately, where Rightpoint would like to take this, and we have a plan to do so, is to produce a product. And I think that product in the form of something akin to an NPS, but brings in more facets, more sentiment, could offer the hope of evolving a problem statement through methodology and into something that could be ubiquitous across a multifaceted total experience landscape that accounts for customers, employees, and products.
I'll look forward to seeing that framework, because that's, and I would have to agree. Who could argue with the proposition?
Yeah.
In concept, it solves it. Working that out because of all of the different, all of those variables, which are thousands and thousands of them, is going to be an interesting process. But return on total experience, yeah. I'm thinking of some of the folks that I get to interact with in the CX space that are so CX focused. You need to be, that's your space. That's what you do. Or I'll just say in my limited world here, most everybody that has an EX function also either has CX as their primary, and CX kind of evolved out of that. But even so, they're just focused on EX. And I think everybody would grimace if you said we're developing a new NPS, if you will, for our worlds. But the thing that seems to solve, in my view, is that, bar none, I can't think of anybody trustworthy who's told me otherwise than that the biggest challenge they have in any of these efforts is to prove return.
Yep. I think that's exactly right.
It's it's a hard question, because a lot of folks in the C-suite have never been presented with evidence that would show that this can be proven. So you have to kind of start with, yes, it's provable, and then you have to actually prove that, which can be a complex endeavor. But all that to say, yes, in short, I agree with you. It's going to be fun to see how Rightpoint kind of presents that. And just for my part, look, I'm a very, very small entity. For my part, if there's some way that we can help get that word out, exploit that, whatever you want to call it, it's invaluable, and happy to help.
Yep. And I think on the methodology side, I'll walk through an example, which again, I think will certainly evidence the problem statement. I think it'll even pay off on the methodology. And then again, I'm going to take that rain check to come back with a product frame here. But, we'll often talk in the ubiquitous frame of Jane. And let's say Jane is shopping for car insurance, and that she loves that she can custom design coverage for her and her family needs on the website. So this is a direct, hard payoff on the tried and true frame of customer experience. And if there is a custom insurance website, which lots of insurers struggle with on how to give that optionality to Jane on how to customize that insurance, but maybe with some proper consultation through digital tools, maybe there's a 10% increase in coverage amount in this custom experience frame with the proper implementation of a website. I'll take that forward into an employee experience frame where, let's say, Jane's involved in a car accident and she files a claim. She receives a call from a well-informed employee with details on next steps within minutes. We now have making the best out of a terrible situation of an accident, but maybe a little surprise and delight moment where this employee that now has a single pane of glass customer service implementation in front of them and is able to have the data, provide customer satisfaction faster, and maybe there's a 15% reduction in employee work and complexity. And therefore, because the customer service rep is more satisfied because they're providing higher value, there's less rework. And so much of what we hear is how customer service reps have to toggle between 18 different screens and systems. Right. But if there's this implementation of the single pane of glass, so maybe there's a 5% reduction in customer service rep turnover. So now we've taken that journey, if you will, from the customer, from a custom insurance website implementation through the employee experience in this single pane of glass, and with metrics to prove off across both. And then on the product side, we can use the same customer and say that, Jane's son now has obtained his driving license, and she adds him to the policy using the mobile app, which has created a prompt for you now have increased risk and liability. So maybe adding an umbrella policy could behoove, you and your family. So now there's this upsell, cross-sell app functionality that to me would represent a better product experience. So again, from a methodology standpoint and paying off on the problem statement, I don't think there's a lot of Janes, out there that would attest to having this experience that has taken somebody through digital channels, customer experience, employee experience, and into product experience, with having measurable movement of the needles at every facet there. So I think that starts to unpack a problem statement against the methodology and some of the work that we're doing to bring ubiquity to these lots of snowflake different examples in the form of a product can really set the stage and to entice on organizations that they'd love to plug in, see how they score today, and what does it look like for them to close their own gaps.